You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back into a brand new episode of Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast here on the Locked On NFL Network, your team every day from the South Stands to the end zone. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, joined alongside our co-host, Sayre Bedinger. Both of us were Broncos analysts for the Locked On NFL Network and 9 News. Sayre's also the site expert over there, predominantly orange of the fan-sided network. And we have a Broncos game day kickoff special episode here on today's episode of the show. We're taking a look at some news and notes and injury update status on Mike Boone, who went down in Thursday's practice in joint training camp practices with the Vikings. Plus, we get into our 3 things that we're looking forward to seeing, not to mention our keys to the game on today's episode of the show. Sayre, we are legitimately just about 24 hours away from kickoff. Some people are listening to this on Saturday morning, and it is game day. The excitement is still there, man. How you doing?
Doing great. You know, I think last night was the first time I've been jealous of a Pittsburgh Steelers and Philadelphia Eagles game in my life. You know, just preseason action. I'm jealous of other teams getting to watch their guys play, and especially for the Steelers, man. How rude is that? They get 2 games before we get 1. I mean, come on. But it's exciting. I'm really, really pumped and can't wait to see this game against the Vikings.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot riding on it. And watching the preseason games from Thursday and Friday night kind of reminded me a little bit that the preseason is not at what you see in the regular season in terms of the pace and the looks. You see a lot of base schemes. We saw Mac Jones debut. We saw Cam Newton. We saw Chase Young destroy Cam Newton almost. And so it's, the storyline's right himself. So I don't expect that we're going to see a lot of high-flying action necessarily from the game pace standpoint, but I'm just excited that Broncos football's back. And I'm super excited, see the starters a little bit, but more importantly, I like watching the second string, third string, fourth guys fight for a roster spot. It's my favorite thing of the preseason. But let's jump into our Broncos news and notes here, Sayre. Now, we were a little worried on Thursday in joint training camp practices when Mike Boone went down with the leg injury, was carted off. Luckily, the MRI came back, according to our 9 News reporter, Mike Kliss. 4 to 6 weeks for Mike Boone. No surgery necessary. That is a tremendous, I think, weight off the shoulders of the Broncos. Now, yes, 4 to 6 weeks. That's still a pretty significant timeline, but there is a chance he could be ready for the start of the regular season.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really a best case scenario almost if you have a guy that's carted off the field. I mean, of course, you'd rather them just think, well, that was just a precaution to cart him off the field. But I think given the fact that, like you mentioned in yesterday's show, that he tried to walk it off and couldn't, I think it's really a best case scenario that you're looking at, hey, potentially by week 1 of the season, he could be ready to go again. So I think it's really good news overall. Of course, it's never good news when somebody gets injured, but having to deal with the aftermath of that, I would say 4 to 6 weeks, pretty solid. And like I said, with the baseball analogy, those guys pull up lame, running, sprinting to first base, and you just never know if it's going to take them that full amount of time or not. So I think this is something that you definitely have to kind of wait until he's back 100% so that it doesn't, pun intended here, pop up again.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Quads can be tricky. I'd say anytime you have a muscle injury or a ligament injury, I always worry about that because all it takes is one wrong move. Like you could have 6 weeks of recovery in physical therapy and rehab, one wrong move, and all of a sudden it sets you back another 4 to 6 weeks. So that leads me to my next point here. With the injury to Mike Boone, we know his timeline. There's a chance he's ready for week 1, but obviously the NFL preseason is determined to filter out your roster. We talked about it probably a couple of weeks ago here on the show. The Broncos could maybe carry 4 running backs on the roster. I mean, I feel like this now increases the likelihood of that happening with Boone being out, because how much do you want to run a guy like Javonte Williams or Melvin Gordon in the preseason? You have 3 games. You're going to get some action, but how much do you want to run them in these matchups when you have guys like Crockett and Royce Freeman, who we talked about as potentially maybe being a trade option if he could build his value up for the Broncos? I feel like this might increase his chances of staying on the roster.
I agree with you completely on that. I definitely agree that it increases Freeman's chances. I also think if you're Levante Bellamy or if you're Demario Crockett at this point, you've got to be thinking, all right, I'm really bummed for my boy Mike Boone to get injured. At the same time, now I've got 3 games to really go out and take a lot of carries. Like you said, I don't think we're going to see a ton of Melvin Gordon. I hope we don't see a ton of either him or Javonte Williams, to be perfectly honest with you, especially given this injury now, so we're seeing teams like the Los Angeles Chargers just completely wipe their star players out of the equation for preseason games. I don't necessarily think we're going to see that in Denver, but I'm with you, man. I think that Royce Freeman definitely new life in his time with the Denver Broncos. But of course, we also just got done talking about the fact that Boone, hey, you could be ready for the start of the regular season. So I think that also means that there's a decent chance that, okay, if we still get a good offer for Freeman and one of Crockett or Bellamy really plays well, I think you've still got the opportunity to maybe get as much value as you possibly can for him.
I think those are great points that you make there, Sayre, and it's something we're going to continue to monitor all throughout the preseason, and we're hoping Mike Boone's physical therapy. I know our guy Mario is probably going to work on it and help him get right. Like I said, Mario worked on my back. I had a back muscle injury, and I couldn't walk, and Mario fixed it just like that. So I imagine that, our good friend Mike Boone's going to be in great hands there. But, Sayre, you brought up something yesterday that we were talking about when it comes to George Paton, obviously meeting with the media. But he talked a lot about some of these second-year players like KJ Hamler, Lloyd Cushenberry, the steps that they've taken. And we've seen KJ Hamler making plays. I mean, he absolutely just destroyed the Vikings secondary in both days of joint training camp practices. What were your thoughts on George Paton's comments about these two players specifically?
Well, I think when John Elway, was kind of in the process of hiring a new general manager, he really talked about wanting to bring in fresh eyes. And so I think that with George Paton bringing in his fresh eyes, his fresh perspective from Minnesota, that really, kind of enhances, okay, if he's sticking with certain guys at certain positions, I think that really speaks volumes, because he doesn't have to. He's the general manager of the team. He didn't draft a lot of these guys. Most of the team he didn't draft. He didn't sign or trade for most of the team. So I think him coming in and speaking highly of both KJ Hamler and Lloyd Cushenberry, two guys that, if we're being honest, last year there was a lot of question marks for both guys. With KJ Hamler, the question marks have been injuries, hamstring issue, those type of deals, and wondering, okay, can he even string together a couple weeks of practices, which Vic Fangio again alluded to. With Cushenberry, it was, man, he really started off looking like a rookie center out there. And it kind of just lingered and just very slowly and gradually improved over the course of the season. So for George Paton to come in and say, first for Cushenberry specifically, for him to say, man, he looks like a completely different player than what we saw on tape. That's a high compliment, I would say, for Lloyd Cushenberry. And then for KJ Hamler, like you said, you got to go out there and make plays. You can't just be fast. You got to make plays. And we've seen a number of really big plays from KJ Hamler throughout training camp, and then kind of capping off these joint practices against the Vikings. So for George Paton to come out and recognize that, I think he's on a different level of Vic Fangio, right, in terms of giving praise and kind of being critical. But at the same time, for your general manager to come out and say these things specifically about you, I think that's huge.
Well, and George Paton has been very open with the media. Usually we get a lot of GM speaking. Look, maybe George Paton is so good at it, we're not realizing it's just GM speak, but I feel like he's had this more openness to him. In media interviews, we talk about Peter King, just open about why they made the decisions that they made. You never really get that from GM. So I'm hoping this approach that we're getting with George Paton, I think, will lead to some beneficial elements to the team down the road, something I'm looking forward to seeing. But, coming up here in just a moment, Broncos country, Sayre and I, we're going to talk about the three things that we're looking forward to seeing in today's matchup, in Saturday's matchup against the Minnesota Vikings. But before we do that, folks, I have to tell you about Built Bar, which is one of the sponsors of today's episode of the show, and Peanut Butter Brownie is back. You've been listening to this podcast. Peanut Butter Brownie is my favorite Built Bar because it tastes legitimately like peanut butter and brownie, which you mix those together with 100% chocolate. It is the perfect treat, not to mention it is a great snack. It's also great if you like to work out. You need something to give you a boost afterwards because it contains 17 grams of protein, only 130 calories, and only 4 grams of sugar. That is why I rock with Built Bar. Not to mention they have 9 amazing, delicious flavors. They're adding more flavors, and they're also having the occasional limited time flavor. So make sure you check that out at Built.com. And when you go to Built.com today and you go to checkout, when you get yourself a box of Built Bar, you can get a mixed box of all the flavors to see which one you love best. Enter promo code LOCK15. That's going to get you 15% off your next order. Once again, promo code LOCK15 is going to get you 15% off your next order at Built.com. All right, Sayre, jumping into the three things that we are watching for in Saturday's matchup against the Minnesota Vikings. It could be anything from a schematic standpoint to just players in general. But I wanted to start things off. We touched on a little bit at the start of this show here today, watching the other preseason games, the pace, it just seemed a lot slower in those other games in comparison to really what we see in the regular season. Now, for me, I'm interested in this because it allows you to see if the players, right, whether it be quarterback, offensive lineman, defense, if they're able to execute just the base standard packages of what the team runs both on the offense and defensive side of the ball. This is one area I'm looking forward to seeing. What's an area you're looking forward to seeing?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier a little jealous of the Pittsburgh Steelers and Philadelphia Eagles game, and I got a chance because I write about the NFL draft. I write about prospects as well. Got the chance to kind of dive into a little bit of what Dwayne Haskins was doing and how they're kind of, working him back from the disaster that was his tenure with the Washington football team. So what the Pittsburgh Steelers, I noticed, are doing, and Haskins is probably throwing about 40 passes in 2 games. They're really, really emphasizing, score of the game doesn't matter, et cetera, et cetera. They're really emphasizing, all right, we want to see how this guy adjusts to his pre-snap reads. So what I can tell that they're doing is they're asking Haskins to go out there, scan the field, do your thing, make your decision, not necessarily predetermine where you're going to throw the ball, but based on the coverage that you're seeing pre-snap, have your first read in mind and just throw it with timing, throw it with accuracy. Get the ball to your guy. If it's your back, get the ball to the back. If it's a tight end trying to split a zone, it doesn't matter if it's 4 or 5 yards. And I really want to see the Denver Broncos do something similar with Drew Lock. I want to see Drew Lock be able to operate the short game with accuracy. We know that Lock loves to take deep shots downfield, so we need to see him do that eventually. But I think for this game, I want to see a lot of just different play action concepts, a lot of short passing concepts, a lot of timing and rhythm concepts, especially from Drew, to just be able to say, okay, we can trust that you've got this timing down. We can trust that you can make this throw, the easy throws. I think that's something that Locke needed to improve on based on last year. And so I really hope we get a chance to see it.
I'm glad you brought that up because, it popped up in my Facebook memories. One of the clips, right? The Drew Lock game against the Houston Texans regular season back from 2019. And just looking at that, I mean, he was making plays with his arm, but mechanically he was awful from the standpoint of throwing off of his back foot, drifting. Now, everything that we've seen so far here in training camp, he doesn't have that drift to him, especially even on plays, because look, the Broncos offense has a lot of plays where they're rolling out, they're throwing on the run too, which is a nice addition to see out of this West Coast offense with Pat Shurmur. I'm not seeing that drift back with Drew. Now, once you get to an actual game situation, for me, I'm looking forward to seeing, does he still maintain what we've seen so far in practice of not drifting away when throwing? To me, I think you nailed it perfectly, Sayre. You want to see him do these things and maybe he's been trying to improve on. I think that's what you're going to see. You're not going to come out here and just air it out all crazy in the preseason. And look, we have to say this, Sayre, unfortunately, but Broncos fans, regardless if the Broncos win or lose, don't matter if it's 38-3, what can they do? You have to go out there and see the execution standpoint from a play-to-play basis. And I had a great conversation with Trey Wingo on his podcast, More Than Football. He was grateful enough to have me on to talk specifically about the NFL preseason. And he said it best to me, Sayre, and it really stood out with me. A lot of people don't understand the true value of NFL preseason. It's not about wins and losses. We can go back to when the Detroit Lions, they went 4-0 in the preseason. They went 0-16 in the regular season. The Broncos that year also went 4-0 in the preseason, if I'm not mistaken, and they didn't have a winning record. But outside of that, what factors in for preseason for me, if you look at your first team offense, let's say they get one drive. Sayre, if they lead a 12-play drive downfield, they look sharp for the most part. And even if they settle for a field goal, you're pleased with that because that's just a part of the process, what you're going to get in a game. So for me, I'm looking forward to seeing that a little bit. But the other thing I'm looking forward to seeing is special teams. Now, this is the one side of the ball, Sayre, that really is not limited by preseason in any way, shape, or form. Offenses aren't going to give their full playbook out there. Defenses aren't going to really even send their blitz packages after opposing teams. However, special teams remains the same. Can we see this unit improve from a kick coverage, kick return coverage? Can they set up returns for the punt returners? Can they field the returns? And more importantly, can Brandon McManus continue to be accurate, which so far through training camp and our joint practices, Luke Braun of Locked On Vikings was saying that he was just so consistent at nailing everything that it made him as a Vikings coverage guy jealous because the Vikings have never had that.
Man, that's tough, isn't it? I feel like we've taken that a little bit for granted with McManus. He has had his moments, to be fair, but I kind of think McManus is a living legend. I can't remember if I said that to you before or not, but that Super Bowl 50 run, he has become kind of a living legend. So,
Absolutely.
and I'm with you. Absolutely with you, man, on special teams being a key and what we're watching for in this game. And defensively, I think because of what you said, you're exactly right. We're not going to see a ton of complex blitz packages. What we are going to get a chance to see is who wins one-on-one matchups, whether that's edge rushers, whether that's D linemen, whether that's linebackers covering in the flats, whether that's DBs put on an island. I think we are going to be able to take some, plenty of evaluation away, even though these concepts aren't being completely installed, which is great. Like you said, the best part about the preseason is being able to see your second and third string players. And I think that there's a lot of people out there who make light of the preseason because of that. Like, talking about it just in terms of, well, these are just a bunch of guys, hundreds, if not thousands of guys that aren't going to be on NFL rosters in a couple weeks. And that's not the perspective that I take, man. And I know you don't either. I take the perspective of, man, any one of these thousands of players, whether it's the Broncos or not, could be part of our team going forward in the future. And so that's always something to watch for.
That's a great perspective to have, Sayre. I think you absolutely nailed that. And look, I'm excited. Kickoff 2:00 p.m. Mountain Time on Saturday, NFL Network, also local channels in Denver if you're there with the 9 News broadcast. Outside of that, Sayre, we're going to get into our keys to the game coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, I have to tell Broncos fans about the other sponsor of today's episode of the show. That's your good friends over there, betonline.ag. And BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to bet on all of your sports action. The Broncos, Vikings, they kick off, and you can put your money on the line if you believe that the Broncos are going to win. They're 2-point favorites right now, if I'm not mistaken, and BetOnline has the opportunity to give you the chance to win a little bit of money on the game. Then again, when we look at the realm of sports betting, betonline.ag is the most reliable as they come. They cover every sport from NFL, NHL, MLB, NBA, and all of your UFC and MMA action. Sports are widely unpredictable, but betonline.ag makes things simple for you. And you don't have to stay on the sidelines anymore, as this is your chance to get into the game as NFL preseason games continue to kick off with 10 games of action on Saturday all across the National Football League. So I want you to head to the website or use your mobile device today to sign up. And when you sign up, you can get a 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit when you use promo code LOCKEDON. BetOnline, your online sportsbook experts. Sayre, as we jump into the fourth quarter action of today's episode, Locked On Broncos, just a reminder, Broncos country, if you're listening to this on your favorite podcast provider, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or the Odyssey app, make sure you hit that follow or subscribe button. Daily Broncos news, content, and coverage in audio format every day. And if you want to see this in video, we're available on YouTube. And if you have friends and family who are Broncos fans, put them onto the Locked On Broncos podcast so they can go into every single day and every Sunday, every matchup with the most well-thought-out information and objective coverage on the team that you root for on Sundays, courtesy of Sayre Bedinger and myself over here, Locked On Broncos. But Sayre, let's get into the nuts and bolts of today's episode of the show, Keys to the Game. And this is always one of my favorite parts every single week, analyzing the matchup, seeing what the team needs to do. I know I have my keys. I know I have your keys. I'm going to start off with the first key to the game that I have, and I think that the Broncos should really try to come out in this game and establish the run. Try to establish it because they didn't try to establish it enough last year. This is a chance that you can work on some things. Now, granted, considering the injury to Mike Boone, it could change maybe the coach's philosophy maybe this week. I hope that's not the case because you still have other tailbacks like Levante Bellamy, Demaria Crockett, and a little bit of Javonte Williams sprinkled in here and there. Hey, you can even use Adam Prentice, the fullback, if you want to run the ball a little bit. But I want to see them do that because they struggled against that in joint training camp practices against the Vikings. The Vikings defensive front out of a 4-3 really made things difficult for the Broncos offensive line to move the ball. Royce Freeman had a couple of big runs in practice, but this is a game situation. It matters here, and that's one of my huge keys to the game.
Yeah, I think that's great. And in terms of both the running backs and the O-line getting involved, and especially with, the O-line struggling a little bit in the joint practices, I think that's a huge key to the game, being able to establish that run, being able to get physical, see how really improved that Mike Munchak unit is. I would say a key for me, Cody, in this game is definitely going to be accuracy and decision-making from the QBs. I know that we talk about the QBs so much over the course of the offseason, but for the last however many months, that's all been either hypothetical or opinion-based or in theory this or in theory that. Now we're going to get to see these guys in game situations, and we can actually evaluate some throws. We can actually evaluate some of their rhythm. And I think what these guys both have to do, given their situations with Drew Lock being the starter to open the game and then Teddy Bridgewater coming in shortly thereafter. I think they both have to establish good timing, good rhythm. They've got to be accurate. They've got to be able to get those receivers and throw them to spots. And I'm excited to see that. I think that's an absolute key to this game. Like you talked about earlier, this is all for evaluation standpoint. The score is borderline irrelevant. We'd love to see the offense score points, but at the same time, I would rather see a good series or 2 or 3 or however many each QB gets.
I think that's a great point that you make there too, because like I said, the wins, they don't matter. The losses, they don't matter. It's all about growing and improving. And that's exactly what Broncos coaches are going to do, and the players are going to get the film from this game. They're going to go back and they're going to say, okay, hey, here's what we need to work on this offensive concept. Here's what we need to work on defensively here. The other thing I'm looking forward to, Sayre, is takeaways. The Broncos first-team defense made things difficult for the Vikings first-team offense, which we're not going to see much of Kirk Cousins, not much of any of the starters in Minnesota anyways. But outside of that, even the second-team and third-team defense, for the most part, they were having some success. A couple of takeaways, some passes batted down to the line of scrimmage, tipped up into the air, intercepted. I want to see guys like P.J. Locke, Caden Stearns, Jamar Johnson. I want to see those secondary guys eat. I want to see the linebackers fill against the run. I just want to see a few takeaways. Now, if the Broncos could get 2 takeaways in this game, Sayre, I'm going to be a happy camper.
100%. Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of oddly been an issue with the Vic Fangio defense since he came to Denver, right? Is creating turnovers, and it's not Vic's fault necessarily. A lot of that is personnel based. A lot of turnovers, are luck. We saw a number of them taken away last year due to penalties. So yeah, I'm definitely with you on that. And I think as well, definitely want to be the players that we're talking about in the post-game podcast. That's another key to the game. Be the player that everyone's talking about after the game. Whether you get 1 opportunity or whether you get 10 opportunities, whatever that may be, whether it's catching a pass, throwing the ball, making a block, making a tackle, creating a turnover, forcing a turnover, be the guy that we talk about, because everybody everywhere is able to see every angle of the game, and we're going to see everything that happens. And so be the player that the people in the media, that the people on podcasts that everyone's writing about, be that player in this game.
I think that's a great point that you mentioned that too, right? Because your stock can rise or fall exponentially in the preseason based on performance. And look, I actually just had a conversation the other day, Sayre, with Jack Williams. I don't know if you remember him, but he's back. 2008 draft pick, obviously a good friend of mine. He made the Broncos in the preseason. It was against the Arizona Cardinals. He had that interception. He pinballed off of guys, and all of a sudden he became a big-time player, and then he tore his ACL, unfortunately. But, it was great talking with Jack. And, he's obviously part of that draft class there with Ryan Clady and Wesley Woodyard, players that we value and respect so much from their time with this franchise, which under-the-radar players could be those next players here in the preseason. I know that's something we're going to look forward to in Broncos country. On tomorrow's episode, Lockdown Broncos, you're going to get an immediate post-game report following the conclusion of the Broncos-Vikings preseason action. Sayre and I, we're going to break down the game. We're going to give our takeaways. We're going to talk about players that stood out or players that might have disappointed in action. We're going to break it all down here on the YouTube channel, Lockdown Broncos, also on your favorite podcasting platform, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or the Odyssey app. But until then, I'm Cody, Roark, host of the show, speaking for my good friend Sayre Bedinger. We'll see you then for a brand new post-game report on Lockdown Broncos.